All right. Welcome again to our third in our series of parent empowerment sessions. We are excited tonight to welcome Naim Madyun, who is one of our PGCPS school psychologists. My name is Marcy Torshin. I'm with the Family Support Center. And we also have Dr. Beth Hare, Angela Salmaron, and Yvette Young, who are also with the Family Support Center. And Naim is presenting tonight on grief and loss and moving through those processes at home and school. So Naim, I'm going to stop sharing and I will let you share your screen and get started.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thank you, Marcy. Let me see if I can find the right way to share my screen. Here we go. Yes, thank you again for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts with you all. Like Marcy said, I'm a school psychologist in Prince George's County, and as I see it, part of my role is to support children in accessing the curriculum. And for whatever reason, this concept of grief keeps coming into my mind in terms of how we support or do not support our children through this very tender and complicated process. So this is something that I've put together to kind of give some things to think about, some things to work through in terms of how to support our students, how you may be able to support your child at school when there is a loss at home. So to start, typically I like to do, and we like to do certain types of check-ins to kind of make sure we're engaged with the material and are present. And for this particular one, I want you to think about a favorite saying that you learned growing up that you still think about a lot today, or some advice that someone gave you. Um, the one I'm going to pull, um, the one I'm going to talk about is a saying from Willie Weeks at the bottom of this obituary that I pulled. It's an obituary from Helena, Arkansas, which is where I was raised. And the person's name is Willie Weeks, who's the son of the person in the obituary, Mrs. Mamie Lee Johnson. She passed away a couple of years ago, age of 91, and Mr. Willie Weeks was about 20 years older than me. The saying he used to say all the time was, "I've been your age. You ain't never been mine. Listen to what I have to say." And it was really good advice that he would give me afterwards. And the reason I pulled this um, from the obituary is because I recognized when I was putting this presentation together, I use this saying all the time. I like to use it as a check-in, and I didn't have a picture of him. I didn't have a reference to his obituary because he's passed away. In this obituary, you'll see that it says the son preceded the mom in death. And like I felt something that I've been using this saying from him all the time. I really appreciate that he used that saying, and I learned so much from it, and I could operate from it. And I never really told him this, and I didn't have anything to kind of hold him by or remember him by, even for this presentation. So I was working through some of that. But I like that saying because one of the things about the saying, couldn't figure out why. I was in high school at the time. This was my neighbor 2 doors down. I couldn't figure out why this person that I thought I had more book knowledge than could give me such smart advice. And then eventually I learned, or I realized as I got much older, anybody who has an experience that you haven't had can teach you what it's like to experience life. And that is where he got a lot of his wisdom and knowledge from. And that is part of the spirit in which I put this together. I'm hoping to bring together some different experiences from lots of different people who've experienced different things to help us have an understanding of how they navigated life, and in particular, this complex um, topic of grief and these complex topics of going through grief and grieving in the school system. So any favorite sayings or advice, you can put them in the chat or you can think about them and hold on to them. but I've been your age and never been mine. Listen to what I have to say. It's a hard statement to come back to if somebody says that to you because there's truth to it. So the objectives for this presentation is to share the various ways that our children may experience and express grief. So the many different ways that they may feel the grief and then also try and work through that grief. And then we're going to add another layer to that. How might that grieving process impact the student in terms of their behavior or performance in school? I think I see in the chat, um, is there coming in the chat advice? Oh, you have to go where I have always been was a version that was shared with me. Ah, I like that. I like that. If there are any others in the chat, feel free to let me know if I missed them. And that's part of the process, like learning from each other, pulling from each other of about how they've navigated. After we talk through how it might impact school performance, we're going to add another level or layer to this conversation or to this presentation about how the presence of a disability might influence the grieving process and how it might also influence the strategies we use to support someone going through the grieving process. And then last but not least, but hopefully one of the more important objectives that I want to achieve is to, in this presentation, kind of offer a certain level of tenderness to this topic. I want to acknowledge how complex it is, how many different people go through it in many different ways, and how often we don't talk about it because of how delicate it is. And I want to acknowledge that and that we experience it, and the experience of it is based on our own individual realities and our own individual histories connected to our realities. And so hopefully I show some care for that truth. Speaking of care, throughout this presentation, I would invite you to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. I and that could mean pulling away from this presentation because we're going to be talking about grief. We're going to be talking about grieving. It may bring up a lot of different things that may overwhelm you or may be tough to work through. So pull away from the presentation if you need to. What I like about this slide from Darcy Keogh, a scholar from Melbourne, the Royal Melbourne IT in Australia, is that it breaks self-care down into the personal self-care, like things that you may be able to do at home to kind of refuel you when you're feeling drained. These topics are topics that can kind of pull from or drain our own psychological battery. And we have to think about what can we do to recharge it? Sleep, a healthy diet, exercise. And then also at the bottom, there are different things you can do when you have to move away from your home to maybe work or school to kind of continue to take care of yourself. Taking short breaks. The bottom left, it says reconnect with your purpose, which I like that because it's suggesting that at some point you've been disconnected from your purpose. And you have to find out different things or remind yourself of different things that allow you to feel as though your presence in a particular space has meaning. And you have to think, if you think through those things, the theory is it allows you to feel more healed or more loved or more fueled in that particular space. Or find a mentor, which goes back to the point I talked about Willie Weeks, someone who's had an experience that you haven't had, who could probably teach you how they've navigated that experience. So you can pull from them what you need to pull from, which comes back to what I feel is a good point, a good message from um, this self-care diagram, which is the statement, what works for you? Throughout this presentation, I want you to be thinking about what works for you. Now, I pulled this particular information from Castle. CASEL. That stands for the Collaborative for the Advancement of Social Emotional Learning. They offer lots of different questions that you can ask others to learn how they take care of themselves. You can do this in groups. You can have your children do it in groups with themselves, with different types of questions, asking them how they recharge themselves. Or you can do this in groups with yourself and others, asking them how they do different things to recharge themselves. But the main thing is to think through how others take care of themselves so you can figure out how you will best take care of yourself when you feel as though an experience is draining your psychological battery or your emotional battery. And I say psychological battery, emotional battery, because I feel like some of these topics are sometimes operating like this psychological phone or iPhone where you have these apps that are running in the background and draining our energy. And we have to think of what would allow us to get some of that energy back. And it could be emotionally draining or psychologically draining. So this particular slide, those particular questions are ways to kind of think through the different things that feel good to you, that recharge you. And you can do this in groups or just in conversation with yourself, which actually is one of the ways in which I like to recharge. I like to be in conversation with myself, which is, for me, journaling. One of the ways in which I like to take care of myself is to journal. Because to me, what it does is it allows me to surface some of the things that may be running in the background that I may not be paying attention to, but could be actually draining my battery. And it also allows me to think through different ways to kind of address those battery draining experiences. I put together my journal, my desire to journal as an act of self-care with this particular piece of information from Surviving Childhood Trauma, where they have prompts connected to grief for processing grief. And what I like about this is that the first four, what am I grieving? Where in my body do I feel the sadness? What are my thoughts? And are there times of day that this grief is more amplified? Those first four, actually, in my mind, they function to kind of surface some of those thoughts or feelings that could be operating in the background that could be draining. And then the last three, right, one good memory related to this person, what does my support system look like, and how am I coping with this grief? Those three kind of get into the area of refueling or helping you to think through what could be refueling. So that's what I like to do. Are there things that you like to do to refuel yourself, to take care of yourself, to have those small acts of self-love that refuel you? Feel free to put them in the chat or share those, or just think through those. Now, this slide is getting a little bit ahead of the presentation, but on purpose. And when it's talking about grief, because I haven't really defined grief or grieving. And I probably won't define grief or grieving. What I'm going to do is tell you how others have thought about grief or grieving with the message, the underlying message connected to the earlier point I made of respecting the fact that many people conceptualize this in many different ways and listening to how others conceptualize it may be helpful to help you think through how you want to conceptualize it. And so as part of the definition I'm going to operate from, and feel free to connect with your own, is this work that's being done, this neurological work that's being done by Dr. O'Connor. She's out of the University of Arizona. Recent book, The Grieving Brain, the surprising science of how we learn from love and loss. Oh, I see in the chat that one person wrote one of the acts of self-care is music, which reminds me, one of the acts I do, I love to listen to music that has no lyrics and this allows me to flow. So yeah, music, that's a really good act of self-care. The grieving brain, and it's a neurological approach. And a couple of things I learned from this that I thought would be helpful. And it connects to how a lot of other people conceptualize grief and grieving. And so I felt it was appropriate for this particular space. She argues through a lot of her research, a lot of her neuroscience and psychology research, that we should think of grief as the actual feeling, the emotional, intense reaction to someone dying or to death. It's the feeling that we have. And then grieving is that a process over time of adjusting to how those feelings show up, adjusting to when those feelings show up, and paying attention to the things that can bring those feelings, surface those feelings into the present moment. And so, because of that, she says grieving is actually a form of learning. It's learning how to adjust to those feelings. It's learning how to pay attention to the things that can surface those feelings and learning how to adjust to the person no longer being there, person no longer being present. And she argues that is why, um, in some degree, losing a loved one can feel like losing a part of yourself. And her argument for this is on a neurological level. When we have a relationship with someone, our brain starts to encode a consistent connection with that person to the point that a bond is formed and we're recognized with that person on a neurological level as being bonded so that I becomes a we. And so when that person dies, a part of that bond starts to not make sense in our mind. And so we have these memories and these connections that are still operating as if there is a we there in our mind that we formed, that we've attached to, um, without there actually being a we there. She likens it to, some of you may be familiar with the phantom limb syndrome, where you may have a missing body part, but you still have, your mind is still interpreting signals as if it's there. And according to Dr. O'Connor, your mind is still interpreting signals as if the person is there because you spent so much time creating signals around a coexistence with that person. So the feeling that you have to go through, I thought was important to think through. The learning you have to do is, I thought was important for us to think through, and the actual loss that's going to be present, I think would be important for us to think through. But that's her working definition of grief and grieving. I thought I'll pull a couple of more before we move on, to different ways in which people think through grief or think through the grieving process. And you might see a connection back to Dr. O'Connor's work, where she talks about um, the feeling, the learning, and the loss. This is from the producer, the actress, Regina King, who lost her son a couple of years ago. And recently, she conceptualized grief as a love that's present that has no place to go. So you can kind of see the connection. There was a love for her son. There is a love for her son, and that bond is still in her mind, but she doesn't always have a place to place that love because the son is not physically there to receive it or for her to see him receive it. Francine Wheeler, who's a mom who lost her son in the massacre at Sandy Hook. And it's interesting to see how she talks about the grieving process in terms of her times where she's laughing and then not laughing, celebrating and not celebrating, crying and not um, feeling positive emotions, screaming and grieving. but you're celebrating life in the process and the ups and downs, the back and forth of the process, which connects back to, in my mind, what Dr. O'Connor is talking about, how you kind of work through this relationship with the feeling. And different things may bring it up. And you, over time, have to think through how you might adjust to it. And you may do it well sometimes, you may not other times. And this last one is about the loss of of a of an 8-year-old at Piper Elementary School in Alabama. And as part of the process of trying to work through it, one of her classmates created art to try to make sense of the loss of her friend. And in what I like about it is that she says, I don't know what to say. So I'll pray for you. And it's, to me, suggesting whether she was mentored on how to work through this or she came up with this on her own, regardless, she's okay not knowing how to work through that loss verbally, but at least doing something physically or emotionally to try to work through it. So different ways people think about grief and grieving that I want to use to help us as kind of establish this presentation. And I say all that because people have different definitions, different experiences, and I myself am working through thoughts of how to adjust and work through grief and grieving because I lost someone myself. Um, this is me a couple years ago, just a couple years ago, with my siblings. Far left, I'm the person on the far left picture. I'm the person on the far left. And I'm actually the middle child, even though I'm taller than my older brother. In the middle picture, that's me in the middle, and my mom in the front, and my two siblings on either side, my older brother with the Razorbacks hat, and then my younger brother with the red and black checker shirt. And this is the actual house I lived in high school that was 2 doors down from Mr. Willie Weeks. And on the bottom right, it's me playing the piano. I don't know how to play. I just posed that way. With my little shirt that I wore for like 4 or 5 years straight, so the sleeves are a little short now in that picture. And so I lost my younger brother my senior year of high school. And I remember finding out the morning I was going to school. My mom had gone back and forth to the hospital. The hospital was 2 hours away. I saw her come back from being at the hospital, from being there for like a week. She came back in the middle of the night. I saw her, and I saw her leave back out. And that was the night he passed. And so this was pre-cell phone and everything. And I'm from a small town. Somehow she communicated to everybody to not tell me anything. So I could find out from my granddad coming to the door before I went to school. And then he told me that my brother had passed away. And so that experience of losing a sibling and then going to school the next day was something that I'm still working through and something that I'm still trying to understand how it impacts students when they experience it. And a couple of things that I want to say about it before I move on to the next slide. What's interesting to me was when I got to school, I wasn't sure who knew and who didn't know. But I could sense people were trying to make me laugh. People were trying to make me feel connected and supported. And then I remember looking out my back, out one of the windows of the classroom. I saw a flood of people walking out and hugging each other. And then I said, oh, they must have all found out too. And I cried for like the first time and last time in connection to my little brother. And I remember them bringing a friend of mine to pull me out of the classroom. And he said a particular joke that was really interesting to me. And it actually did make me laugh. He said that um, I like that I'm your friend because when I tell people today that I'm your friend, I'm getting a lot of hugs from a lot of nice looking people. And it made me laugh. And knowing him, I'm not going to say his name, it was his way of working through his grief also. Which goes back to my point that I keep hoping that you all understand that there's so many different ways that we work through it, that we try to work through it, that we possibly mess up in working through it. But I think that's the human part of what we're trying to do. I'll get back to this story in a little bit. But when you're in school, if you send your child to school and they've experienced grief of any sort, loss of a sibling, loss of a parent, loss of a friend, what are some things that you can look for to pay attention to? This is some guidance from the National Association for School Psychologists. And um, it argues that at different ages, there are different things you could possibly pay attention to notice if your child is struggling as they're working through the grieving process. My classmates I remember they were really observant of me, really paying attention to like different things. They're arguing at the preschool age, really pay attention to not just decrease in talking or inability to remain calm, but possible regressive behaviors, milestones that they've accomplished that now they're struggling with. Could be as simple as potty training or maybe something more in terms of alphabets, but some regressive types of behaviors where they seem to be struggling with things that you felt as though they had already, quote unquote, mastered. At the elementary level, decreased academic performance, attention and concentration, possibly skipping school, or being tardy or avoiding class, a little bit more irritable, some acts of aggression, or maybe that overwhelming energy is finding itself in the classroom in terms of them disrupting other people or disrupting the classroom environment because they're having difficulty working through all of the emotions within them. Somatic complaints, maybe the energy that they have that's coming from those emotions in their background as leading to some headaches or stomach aches. They're not sleeping or eating right, or avoiding situations altogether to kind of protect themselves. And I think it's an interesting one, this next one, which is guilt, which often I don't think we think as being something that a student at elementary level would be feeling in terms of someone passing away, but to what degree may they feel that they might be responsible? Or they're often kind of working through it by repeatedly retelling of the event or the story. And then the middle and the high school level, decreased academic performance, you see some of the same attention, concentration, avoidance, withdrawal, increased likelihood of trying to cope with or address the discomfort or the pain or the loss with high risk behaviors of substance abuse or difficulty with peers, the nightmares, flashbacks, emotional numbing. And that is kind of what I experienced. I did not feel um, afterwards. And I wasn't quite sure I wasn't accessing my emotions or I was just processing it so much that it became less of an emotion and more of a rationalization. Or if I was still trying to keep my brother present in my mind and in my heart, so it didn't feel as um, painful or sad because there was still a strong presence there. Any questions or comments? Because I want to take a break at this moment because I've covered a lot of material and it may have brought some things up for you. And so first I want to ask if there are any questions or comments. And if not, I'm going to use this time to do two things. One, for us to take about a 5-minute break. And then two, during that break, I just want to invite you to pay attention to what you might be doing during that break to take care of yourself. Like I said, I typically write things down, process, but pay attention because whatever you might do might give you some insight to how you might invite someone else to take care of themselves, or how you might best take care of yourself if you experience a similar situation in the future. So let's take a 5-minute break. But welcome back. Welcome back. Hopefully you're able to do something to take care of yourself. Um, and the question I left you with was like, pay attention to what you did. Pay attention to what you used to kind of work through some of the thoughts or emotions or memories that were brought up by this presentation. One of the things I didn't journal, but I did do some breathing after I realized that I wasn't doing anything to take care of myself. As much as I prompted you all and said that's what I wanted you to do, I recognized after 2.5 minutes, I'm doing more thinking and worrying, which is natural, than actually trying to do something to refuel myself. So then I started doing some breathing and reflecting, thinking of some positive thoughts, which brings me to my next point. Like, what do you do? What can you do? And as I was putting this presentation together, I realized that I never really asked my mom, what did she do? Like, what was her plan? What was her thinking, her logic? Was she working or trying to support me in school? My older brother was in college. I was a senior in high school, like I said. So it was a singular focus on me for high school and for him in a different space, in a different state at the same time, actually, which was college. All while she was driving back from 2 hours away where my brother passed away in the hospital. And so I asked her that question just a couple of weeks ago in preparation for this um, presentation, and connected it back to wonder what she was thinking about to take care of the feeling that was coming up, or the learning that she felt I would need, or the loss that was there. Seeing if it would connect. It may not have, but this is what she said. She said, I didn't have a plan, or not a clear plan, other than wanting you to be supported when you were told. My granddad came to the door before I left out the house. It was nicely timed, and wanted you to be surrounded by peers at school. But that means she must have told um, my peers or told teachers to have peers come and reach out for me or connect to me. And doing my best to ensure you guys did not cease any activity. So this is the learning part um, that went with school. So those after school experiences she wanted us to still have, and watching for signs. So being observant, making some indulgences. And so that's my mom's language of saying she kind of probably loosened some of the rules a little bit and probably found some money that we didn't have to kind of make sure we had some things in place if we needed them. If I'm interpreting my mom's language appropriately. Um, and I wanted you to stay busy and enjoy what you could and see that life goes on even through difficulty. So that's kind of trying to support us working through um, an acknowledgement of how difficult and tough it was, but that there's a other side to the pain. Not a pleasurable, permanent other side to the pain, but just that there's an other side to the pain, and it's life after the pain, and working with the pain coming up, leaving, coming up, and leaving. That's my interpretation of my mom. So, how do we support the feeling, the learning, and the loss in school? That's how my mom approached it. We have from NAS different things, characteristics to look for. But what if the student has a disability? What are some of the things to do or to think through to support your child, or to support your student? And so I'm going to use the same framing, the feelings, the learning, the loss from Dr. O'Connor, with some considerations for students with disability. Keeping in mind that I want you to pull from this what may work for you. So I'm thinking through, like, with the feelings, right? the emotional reactions that may happen at different times, sometimes seemingly unexpectedly. One of the things that could be done, especially with a student with disability, would be to uh, find the use of mood maps that are developmentally appropriate. So having your child or having your student just kind of check in could be as simple as on the map, are you feeling positive? Or on the bottom of the map, are you feeling bad today? Or you can have it be something I think we did at the Family Support Center, different days of the week with the weather for the days of the week to represent the possible different moods. Just kind of something that's developmentally appropriate. Or you can make it as complex as the various degrees of the different dimensions of emotions to kind of see where they are in terms of the moods, keeping in mind that it may change from time to time, from situation to situation, which require a ritual of frequent check-ins because it may change, because there's different antecedents or different settings or different things that may bring up those moods. So have a set time of consistent check-ins across different settings to kind of get a sense of what those moods are. I think my mom said she was much more observant, trying to look, trying to check. And then the learning piece. One of the things I would suggest would be try to identify as many adjustments that might have to be made when that person no longer has that other person present in their life. What are those adjustments that have to be made? What if they lost their father and their father used to make uh, a particular type of breakfast before school, and your student's a student with autism, and they are very regimented. They're very um, routinized. And so you have to think through how would you adjust for the fact that maybe the child's finicky, they like certain things a certain way, and they're very structured, and the father who they no longer have is the one who used to make this particular breakfast before school. Well, whenever we're talking about learning and learning to adjust, we try to come from a place of strengths, right? And so I'm just throwing ideas out there for you. Again, what works for you, but hopefully would trigger in your mind some things to think about. But what if your child and he has autism? What if your child was really someone who was good at singing, really good at making up songs, and you had them um, make up a song that acknowledged that they love their daddy's pancakes, and the song was called Daddy's Pancakes. So you made this song up for them that you start to learn together and play together, and they really love this song. And now they sing this song before you make this mommy's pancakes or guardian's pancakes to try and adjust and have them learn something new, focus in area of strength. But the key is identify the places where you may have to adjust and they may have to learn new things, new routines. And then for the loss piece, I'm stretching this a little bit, but I'm pulling from the work of Dr. Pauline Boss, who's done a lot of good work in the area of ambiguous loss, which is basically this concept of how to deal with the feeling of grief when the person is physically not there, but there's no proof that they actually died. So psychologically, you're still very much present in your life. And you're talking about, in the more extreme cases, um, lost in possibly war, you have no proof that they actually died. And so the loss is not definite, and so physically they're not there, but psychologically they're still there. Or the ambiguous loss piece of it is the opposite, where um, physically they are there, but they're not the same as they used to be cognitively or emotionally. So you have a loss of who they once were. And so I'm using this term to say that with ambiguous loss, it often is unrecognized, those little bitty pieces of the loss that actually feel like death, but are not recognized as death because the boundaries are kind of blurred. Closure is not necessarily um, um, brought into the present. And so, one of the things, and this is what my mom tried to do, would be argued to do for a student with disabilities, is really pay attention to the little bitty areas that you may notice that there is a loss that's impacting your child and that you would not have thought about, and make a lot of guesses about where those losses might be, a lot of guesses about where those losses might be and how to address those guesses. And when you find them, acknowledge them. Acknowledge them as a real loss. A lot of times with ambiguous loss, those go unrecognized. So not having the parent there to make those particular types of pancakes is a real loss that could feel similar to grieving psychologically, neurologically, even also too. Just um, some guidance of what to think about in terms of how disability might impact your child in the school. From guidance from NASP, in terms of things to pay attention to with the feeling and the learning the loss, this would be mindful of anniversaries, birthdays, and different types of milestones. So those are things that bring up those feelings again, and you may have to learn to adjust because there are losses that are definitely present during those particular times. And again, from NASP, they say to avoid using euphemisms, saying that child, this person is no longer here, or trying to move around the word move around the fact that the person that actually died by saying um, uh, that yeah they're no longer here, or they've gone to a better place, or any type of euphemisms we sometimes use to try to not say that the person died. They argue also try to avoid. I see a raised hand. Yes.
So I just have a question. How would you adjust or um, apply these considerations for a child that may have a lower cognitive level? You know, someone who may not be able to express themselves verbally or have a clear understanding of what loss is,
So
or
I think
can't articulate, a clear understanding of the loss.
so the person can articulate a clear understanding of the loss, but they don't have a clear understanding of what the loss is. Is that
Or a
the question?
combination, yeah, a combination thereof. Because I'm thinking about, um, a situation we were in when we had a student who had a lower cognitive level who experienced the loss, and like those things you were saying to look for when you were saying a younger kid, or a middle or high schooler,
Hmm.
or what are some things that parents can look for in their children that may not be able to verbally articulate um, a loss, or might not have a full understanding of the loss, or we assume that they don't have a full understanding of the loss.
Yeah, and so right, that's getting into a couple of areas. One is to try and see first if you can give them an understanding of what loss is. I think some of the guidance suggests that sometimes we feel as though um, the child doesn't understand, and so we tend to minimize, we tend to make other types of statements because we feel as though they do not understand, and try to first see. There are three things they say you should consider to, to test and see to what degree they understand. One is the universality of 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 death, the inevitability um, of death, and also the irreversibility of death, the degree to which it can't be. If those things are difficult, then I would argue, going back to the earlier slide, to focus on just the concept of loss in general. Try to just get them to understand just the concept of loss, and then pay attention to what changes in them, or what may have changed in them in terms of, I would argue, the main things: appetite and irritability, in terms of things, routines, or different experiences not being as enjoyable as they once were. Those are, to me, two areas of natural pleasure that may not be pleasing anymore or as pleasing. So they may be signs that the child is struggling with that loss. Earlier, I showed the example of a child doing artwork, and some argue that even though they may not be, even understand you correctly, articulate with words the best way, they may not be able to articulate with words if they're working through some loss. Having them draw out their understanding of what that particular loss means to them may give you some clues of how they're seeing it and how it's impacting them. And doing some type of possible joint art projects with them, just simple drawing of the loss to see how it's showing up. Was that helpful? Or maybe not.
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And that's the tricky part of this, right? Knowing what to consider and what not to consider, what to avoid or what not to avoid. The last part of this is to try not to predict someone else's timeline or someone else's process of going through grief. And to be sensitive to the fact that some may take longer, or it may not look as though they're grieving at all, and try not to predict what they're going through as much as try to understand what they're going through. And try to maintain routines, try to understand what they're going through as much as possible. Give them opportunities to grieve, connect them to helping professionals. These are different things to try to help them go through. When under the encourage the adaptive coping strategies, that's the artwork, possibly, or connect them to friends, or put them to extracurricular, something that would allow them to process some of those emotions in ways that are healthy. Once you start to gather this information, the things you know about your child, let the educators know what you've picked up on, what you've learned, what you're seeing as the different triggers, or the fact that they struggle to actually articulate it, but you can tell that they're struggling with the loss when you see them start to do certain behaviors or avoid certain experiences. That is another way to support your child, by educating us or the other educators about what you've noticed that's changed in your child's behavior and in terms of where they experience joy, or the things that they're not doing to refuel themselves. Okay, just want to take another quick break, and then we're going to move on to the end where we're going to get some more of a conversation about, or more of a learning about the inclusion of disability into this conversation. So welcome back. I hope you were able to take some time to recharge yourself, or just process, or do what's necessary to take care of yourself. I want to try and introduce another level and layer, and I mean that, a level and another layer into this presentation with disability, but in a way that hopefully appropriately add some complexity to this. This concept of double mourning, pulling from this research by Judith Brown, uh, where she talks about recurrent grief. She interviewed 6 moms who had individuals with intellectual disabilities, and they didn't necessarily deal with the loss of a child, but the double mourning or the recurrent grief part came in with her argument that, and it came from one of the moms in particular who coined this, that once the parent finds out once that the child has a disability and they go through the personal and the social piece of this, what's happening for them is that their dreams, the parents' dreams of what the child could be, um, are no longer their reality. And at each milestone, they start to feel a mourning or a particular grief for the fact that that particular dream of their own didn't come to fruition. They had to let go of their dream. But then also, um, there's this other mourning for um, the loss of what they feel their child is going to go through. The child won't experience at each particular milestone. So the dream that they had of being a parent at those milestones and the loss that their child is going to have at those different milestones, they're experiencing. So they're going through this double grieving process that happens at all these different milestones. So keep that concept in mind. I'm introducing that. That's one concept. To also connect with some things I think we also need to be considerate of. Okay, the double mourning we're talking about, different milestones along the way, what you as a parent may go through when you think about the dreams that you had that you can't actually realize. Then the genetic guilt part, feeling to the degree to which it might be um, your your fault that your child is not able to experience some of these experiences, and then this wrestling with and struggling with self-compassion. I'm seeing, or I'm thinking, or I'm arguing. Degree to which you feel as though you may not be able to handle, or you may not be able to have the tools necessary, and you're possibly hard on yourself and saying that I don't know how I'm going to support my child through this grieving process. Why me? I don't have the skills. I think all of these three things might be at play when you have a child with a disability and you're going through the grieving process. And I think it may lead us to um, be in a position where we may overreact or underreact in these 4 areas I want to talk about at the end. These 4 areas that I pulled from different sources. And from the Down Syndrome Association, they have this writing where they talk about um, if you have a child with Down syndrome or a child with intellectual disability and they're dealing with grief, there's this wrestle with how much do we focus on grief? And this is connected to one of the questions versus how much do we focus on loss. And I can see a parent going back and forth and really worrying about um, to what degree do I focus on grief or loss? And there may be an overreaction to it because you're worried about what would happen if I don't focus on loss, or what would happen if I don't focus on grief. And I don't know if I'm ready for this, or I want to avoid this because it's going to bring up too many different things. So that's one thing I think we need to really pay attention to, and you need to pay attention to with yourself in terms of like how much you're wrestling over that. And I'm going to say why in a little bit. But then also, and this is from Pacer, who does a lot of good work with individuals with disabilities, and they have this one podcast with grief where the parents talked about the exhaustion that happens from having to decide whether the comments that are coming from others are supportive or hurtful, almost in the area of microaggressions, where you have to kind of be willing to weather all the insensitive statements from others, where they may be saying things like, well, now you can, at least you can start doing these things again now that your child is gone, or now you don't have to worry about missing this particular milestone. You know, those comments where it actually drains the person more when this neighbor or friend feels that they might be trying to be helpful when you just lost a child who has a disability, or your child lost a friend, your child has a disability. Just kind of have to work through or being prepared for the exhaustion of having to hear these different comments. From the Child Bereavement Center in the UK, I was reading through some material where they felt as though a lot of parents, when they have a child with a disability, they go back and forth over and over about how much should I protect my child from this information and not allow them to go through these things because I think it might be painful, versus do I allow my child to express these things? How do I try to promote them to express what they're doing? And there are pros and cons, of course, to when to do and when not to do. But that's another piece that I argue can become very draining and stressful on the parent, wrestling back and forth with that. And this comes to this very last point that I'm going to try to pull this all together and think through how my mom handled the situation and how I'm thinking through how what I'm reading in all the literature and all the experiences from their parents. Um, when I texted my mom finally after um, 30 years, that I think you handled this okay. I like the way you handled my going to school. She texted back, um, thank you. That's all she wrote. And in my mom's speech, it occurred to me a couple of things. One, I wondered to what degree she had been working through, wondering if she was going to make mistakes all the time, how draining that might be, and then not ever knowing to what degree did some of my own um, experiences later in life, in college or after college, may be the result of how she handled or quote unquote mishandled. I'm not saying she did, Mom. I'm not saying you did, mishandled my going to school. But that is something that's also operating in a parent's mind, really worrying about the implications of making mistakes. And then adding on a disability with that, I can imagine a parent always wondering, when my child is missing school, is it because of the disability or regular teenage experiences, or am I mishandling? And so I am um, imagining um, a lot of energy, a lot of care needs to be given to worrying about making a mistake, and that freezing you in the process of not addressing, which is what the literature says, the fact that your child is going through something, needs possibly more than ever your observations, your attention, and you more than ever to let the school know, the teachers know, to be paying attention to those things. So how do you do those things? I don't know. I think that's you when you get in a conversation with others, to listen to how they navigated those and pull from them to see what works for them. But where do you get these resources from? One place I would argue is the Dougie Center. They created these personal spaces for peers to talk to other peers about how they navigated going through grief. And it was birthed out of a child who was having an inoperable tumor, um, going in the hospital, an adolescent in the hospital, and he lamented in a letter to none other than Dr. Kubler-Ross, who came up with the stages of grief, that no one was talking to him about dying. Everyone was trying to avoid it. Everyone was fearful of making a mistake and talking to him, that no one was talking to him at all. So she put him in connection with a local nurse who just started having very serious concrete questions about how she thought his possible opinion past would impact his family, impact him. What was he thinking? Which allowed him to have some really healthy conversations. And she named the center after him to allow others to have the conversations at different levels, youth at different age levels, and then adults. So that's spaces for others to talk through it, to figure out what they did to work through it. Also, this one particular book, The Fall of Freddie Belief, it's a really well done book that actually chronicles the process of an elder or mentor navigating with the youth what happens to others when they fall from the branch and they identify as death or dying, and how to make peace with it. And one of the things that can be good at doing in other books like this, sparking both an understanding for you of how your child is working through or understand death, and what questions they may have that you may be able to correct and talk through with them. So that's another way. And lastly, more importantly, a good resource would be yourself. Figuring out what works for you and being okay with the fact that you will make mistakes. You may have to keep experimenting to figure out what goes on, and identifying like what type of self-care techniques make sense for you and for your child, and seeing it as a process of lifelong learning through the adjustments of having that loss. And I say that because as I was putting this presentation together, I agree. It's an understanding of a relationship with the emotions that come up and how they've adjusted over time, the different things you do to make them less present, or when they are present, how to work through them. But being okay with the fact that they are a natural part of saying that you love someone or you felt love from someone, and it possibly may not be as it once was. So I know this is a lot. I tried to put a lot together to get to a complex issue, but handle it with some care. But more importantly than that, I was wanting to convey that a lot of the questions are within our community if we are in community with each other, which is actually another act of self-care. So are there any thoughts or advice you all may want to offer about how you may have helped a particular person work through grief or grieving and still access the curriculum at school? Or questions for me? If not, I just want to make sure this particular slide is present. In Prince George's County, there are lots of mental health resources that we'd like to make sure our families are aware of, to get information, to just sometimes talk, to learn about other resources. One of the first individuals you can have contact with and be in communication with if you feel as though your child needs access to resources or a person to talk to is the professional school counselor. That may be one of the calls you make to kind of learn how to coordinate resources. I still can't figure out all the way my mom coordinated all these resources without a cell phone back in the day, but she did. And I'm grateful that she did. I'm grateful for you all for listening to me. And hopefully there was one thing that you pull from this that would be helpful for you with someone that you know as we all work through this. Thank you.